It's hump day. I sure hope your week's speeding by. Welcome back, guys, to this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to take us up to Seattle, Washington, where I need you to picture this for a moment. In this day of inventory shortage of boats, you do it. You somehow successfully find that boat you've been looking for, only to have this be the scene a few days later. This is the 84-foot motor yacht Apollo that was docked in Seattle, Washington. Apparently, this boat had just sold a few days prior to this and was being prepped to be moved to its new owners down in San Diego, when all of a sudden a fire broke out in the galley. Currently, the cause of the fire is unknown and under investigation, and fortunately, there was nobody on board at the time, so there were no injuries reported, and somehow miraculously, no other vessels actually caught on fire. But in this tight inventory of boat markets, I feel bad for these buyers. I'm sure they were looking for a vessel for quite some time, and only to have this happen at the end, well, that's just a tough break. And I'm sure they're back to the drawing board, as this is probably a total loss on this vessel. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to India, where this was the scene this past week. This is the scene in the Indian port of Kolkata, where this past week, a container ship was being loaded when all of a sudden the ship started to list and containers began to ship to one side of the vessel, where the vessel wound up partially sinking. Now, an investigation has been launched to try and determine the cause of the incident, but one local port official did tell local media that the berth operator failed to properly handle the vessel while loading containers, thus it lost balance and partially sank. During the time of listing, the vessel lost 18 of its 20-foot containers, which wound up sinking in the harbor. Another 10 of the 40-foot containers that were loaded on the vessel wound up floating in the water, and a tugboat was called in to come in and corral those containers. At this time, they're still working to right this vessel and try and get the cargo out of the water. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us down to Fort Lauderdale in a pretty interesting situation. Many of us would probably remember the old movie Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Never really thought of it as a real career, but apparently this is the real deal. Jamie Katz, pet detective, was called into a Fort Lauderdale couple's home to help them find their dog that they believed had fallen into a canal. By the time Jamie Katz was called in, the dog had been missing for approximately 8 hours, and she showed up to try and help the owners see if they could discover where the dog went.
Yes. Let me do it again and see if it was. Where you at? Hi! Hi! Come here! What? No way! Hi! Your dog? What?
Now, when Jamie showed up on the scene, she was quickly able to determine by the facts she had that she believed the dog had fallen into the canal. The owners had told Jamie they'd already looked for the dog everywhere down there, and at this point they kind of thought they were looking for the body of the dog. But due to Jamie's determination and perseverance, she was able to reunite this pup with its owners, which is just a pretty unique situation. If you go check out Jamie's website, you'll see all the dogs she's rescued. It really is a pretty incredible story, and I highly recommend you check her out. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to stick with animals, when a crew on board the Akora Dolphin sightseeing boat just a few weeks back came across a fishing pot in Havoc Bay. This drew the attention of the captain, as this is actually a marine preserve and fishing is banned. Upon further investigation, as they approached, they found a dolphin actually entangled in the line of the pot. Quickly, the crew on board the vessel stepped into action to try and get the dolphin's tail free from the line. After some quick effort and work, the crew was able to get the mom, whose calf was swimming around the boat in the water, free and back with her child. They did report the incident to the local authorities, who did wind up catching up with the fisherman whose pot it was. They did claim the pot was set outside of the marine preserve and somehow drifted in. It's estimated it was almost a 2-kilometer drift for the pot. They do set the dolphin free and it winds up swimming away with its calf. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to keep us in New Zealand, but unfortunately this story does not have the same happy ending. These images come from a Northland crew rescue helicopter who are responding to a 56-foot fishing vessel called the Enchanter when its emergency locator beacon was activated this past week. The Enchanter was on an extended 5-day fishing trip to the remote Three Kings Island. It had 2 crew members and 8 passengers on board when it's believed the vessel encountered rough weather and wound up breaking apart. When rescue rescue crews originally arrived at the scene, they actually found 3 people almost immediately floating on debris approximately a half-kilometer from the wreck. They did go over to the wreck and wound up recovering 2 more, but unfortunately that's where their luck ran out. Of the 10 people who were on board the vessel, unfortunately only 5 were actually recovered alive. Rescue crews who were interviewed later claimed it was one of the most dramatic rescues they'd ever done due to the extreme conditions they were facing and the remoteness of the location. Our hearts and condolences go out to the families of the lost fishermen. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening on your waterways, be sure to hit me up on Facebook or Instagram and let me know, and you might see your stories over here. Just like Alan Chris, David Klein, and Jamie Katz did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here. If not, we're coming to steal your drain plug.